In this exercise, we're going to be discussing proper constraining techniques. As you go through designing an assembly, you're going to realize there's multiple ways to add constraints. There's way more than one way to skin a cat in Inventor. Some of the things you should always remember is KISS. Keep it simple. The simpler way is the better way. The fewer constraints is the better way. What happens is you say, oh, this only has, 3 or 4 or 6 constraints on this one part. Well, this subassembly has 10 parts, so that's 60 constraints. And then there's 100 subassemblies, so that's 6,000 constraints. And then there's 10 main assemblies, so that's 60,000 constraints. And then those all go into 4 big assembly in 6 different versions. And before you know it, you're into the millions of constraints, lots of calculations Inventor has to do. And if they ever cross-reference each other, just all hell can break loose, basically, because there's so many different constraints. You really will bog your computer down, and you'll bog yourself down when you go back to edit those. So keep it as simple as possible, number one. That is the most important rule. Number 2, you're not required to fully constrain parts, but they should not be left unconstrained. And what I mean by that is when we had that LCD exercise a couple exercises back, the thing could still move around a little bit. It still had a few things that were free to move, but for the most part, everything was locked down. No part could move outside of the assembly. The same goes for my robot here. My robot friend's one of my favorite assemblies. It's the first thing I learned to draw in Inventor. Probably drawn it 1,000 times. It's my little buddy. So I want you to take good care of him. And I want you to make sure that he's not going to lose a tooth. He's not going to lose an arm. When you do this right here, if anything comes off of this, something bad will happen. So make sure that everything sticks together, everything's fully constrained to each other. Not to say that it doesn't have degrees of freedom that are left, but it doesn't have anything that's orphaned or left alone. At the same time, I'm not grounding parts up here other than to just set something here. As you can see what happens there. You get all this weird stuff happening. You start grounding parts way up here, and stuff doesn't work right. You can see there, you get errors. So that's just kind of a temporary fix. You don't want to fully ground everything to lock it down all the time. You want to get the constraints right. This also helps if you ever want to do any kind of FEA analysis. These constraints will actually carry over to those analyses. So you want to make sure that you have this thing properly constrained. As you plan your constraints, the simplest way to do it is to think about how you're going to build your assembly. I'm going to build this robot and it's going to have pins. Well, those pins are going to hold it together. And then those pins are going to be threaded, so those are going to bolt together and it's going to hold the pin in place. And then somewhere on here I'm going to have some super glue because I'm not that good of a builder. I've always got to super glue something on there. And more than likely, there's going to be duct tape involved because you can't have super glue without having some duct tape. So as you get building these things, you have to think about things like that. How am I going to put this together? Where am I going to put the duct tape? Where am I going to put the super glue? And where am I going to put the screws and bolts? And where can I hide all this so nobody realizes that I'm putting screws and bolts in there that shouldn't be? So you think about these kinds of things, and then you apply constraints that make sense to that. For example, I did the insert constraint up here, because this is going to use some kind of locking bearing type thing. Whereas on this end piece here, I don't want this to move. This is where I'm going to use the super glue. The duct tape, well, that's going to be inside. Black tape's going to be all over this thing. Might even use some for decoration. So, I'm going to think about that. I'm going to apply the proper constraint in reference to that. It's not the end of the world if you don't use the proper constraints, but as we learned with our fixture 2 mount, the easiest way to constrain this would be bolting it together. So we would use the assembly constraint and bolt the holes to the holes. And then we put the bolts into the bolt holes. Pretty straightforward. You want to use the common sense approach to anything. So do it like you're going to do it in the real world. Keep it simple. And don't leave it completely willy-nilly, but you don't have to over-constrain it at the same time. Less is more, I guess I should say. So play with this, see what you can do. And remember, KISS is probably the most important thing I can tell you with constraints is keep it as simple as possible. Don't overthink it either. It's not just the amount of constraints you're applying, but don't overanalyze or overcomplicate things by overthinking it. Have fun with this. Play with it a little bit. Maybe put this one together a couple different ways. Undo it. Do it again. Try it over and over again and see if you can put this together using as few constraints as possible and get it fully constrained.